Alright, the second animated Witcher film by Netflix is out, and we have to talk about it. It's called Sirens of the Deep, and it is essentially an adaptation of the short story called A Little Sacrifice from the Sword of Destiny book by Andrzej Sapkowski, which in turn is loosely based on The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. In the general Netflix timeline, the story takes place soon before Geralt and Yennefer meet the Golden Dragon in Season 1. The film adds, removes, and changes a healthy amount of the original story, so I'm going to go over the whole thing and tell you all about it. Starting with Geralt of Rivia. He's the main character now after showing up briefly as a child in the Vesemir anime, and he is out on a contract with Dandelion. Even though he resembles Henry Cavill, Geralt is voiced by the same gentleman who does his English voice in The Witcher 3.
Herbs schmerbs. But how about some Gwent, eh?
And I must say, 10 years later he sounds just as good.
I need coin, peace, and quiet.
I know there are those of you who do not like the English voice of Geralt, but I happen to like it very much, and I was glad to hear it. Dandelion is also voiced by his actor in the Netflix show, who does a great job as well. The man can sing too, so I'm all for it. Now, the character of Dandelion is a little goofier than he is in Sapkowski's book. I suppose that's how he's always been on Netflix. But it might be a bit of a problem here, since he does get rather deep and serious on a couple of occasions during the original story, but more on that later. For now, a giant crocodile dinosaur thing appears. It has sharp claws and very thick armor, which is actually surprisingly lore-accurate. In the books, Geralt talks about how Witchers are better equipped for fighting land-dwelling monsters because those in the sea are often too heavily armored. There's a lengthy fight, Geralt tries attacking from different angles and using different signs, and I must say I do prefer the combat in this animation to the one in Nightmare of the Wolf. Some people disagreed with me back then, but I still think that it was a little over the top. Remember Vesemir shooting out his Ard all the way to the moon? Well, things have been toned down a little here, and I appreciate it. Additionally, there are some neat little details, like what looks like reins around the head of the monster, suggesting that perhaps it was domesticated, and it turns out to be true. It drags Geralt into the depths, where he meets the Merpeople. The story in the books only features a female mermaid, although she does mention the existence of males, and it's nice to finally see them here. What I like even more is that Netflix has kept their manner of speech. They use this customized, song-like form of elder speech, and Geralt awkwardly attempts to do it as well. He's not very good at it, by the way, and you can actually see some grammatically incorrect subtitles when he speaks. So the Merpeople say that the creature is innocent, and it can't possibly be the killer that the Witcher is looking for. Geralt, of course, being the softy that he is,
"You are nothing but a softy. A softy, soft, softy, soft, soft, softy, soft, ow!"
decides to spare everyone's life and leave in peace. Meanwhile, we take a better look at the world of the mermaids, their underwater city, their palace, the people, and in this regard, I would say that this film draws an even greater inspiration from the original fairy tale by Andersen. In there, we also get to experience parts of the Little Mermaid's life. We see her father and her sisters in their own kingdom, and so on. Meanwhile, in Sapkowski's story, the fairy tale inspiration is rather minimal. The whole relationship between the mermaid and the human noble is more of a background for the character drama between Geralt, Dandelion, and Essi Daven. Whereas here, the film leans more towards the story of the lovers and their opposing kingdoms, and I understand the change. It's clear that the producers want fast pacing, lots of action, lots of fighting, and so focusing more on the large-scale conflict allows for that. Though perhaps at the expense of other things. We'll talk more about that soon. But anyway, the point here is the Merpeople and this seal are upset. They're angry, in fact. The humans are getting bold, entering their territories, hunting and gathering their sources of food, hiring witchers to get them. you get the picture. But finally, Sheenaz shows up.
You're not acting because your daughter is in love with the prince!
She's of course the mermaid in the Witcher book. The first thing Sapkowski tells us about her is just how big and shapely her breasts are, and how green her nipples. There's not much of that here, but she is different in other aspects too. In the Witcher book, she is older, I suppose, certainly more mature, more independent and proud, and generally less like a child than she is in the film. Here she's also the daughter of the Mer King and Mer Queen, and she's caught between the wishes of her kingdom and her personal feelings for the human prince, who by the way is a duke in the book. Now the Sea Witch is also a more important character here. Her name is Melusina. There is a siren with the same name in The Witcher 3, but it's likely not the same individual. Melusina is also the name of a certain mythological creature, which kind of looks like a mermaid. And in this story, she's the queen's sister, and she was also the king's first wife, or at least his lover. But apparently, she was unable to bear him children, and so she got replaced. And she's now evil.
But we both know who he loved first.
So luckily, Dandelion gets invited to the Royal Spring Festival, and this is where Essi Daven shows up. Now, she is the inspiration for the character of Priscilla in The Witcher 3, both in terms of appearance and profession, and even her relationship with Dandelion. Although the nature of the relationship is different, Priscilla is his lover, whereas Essi was a friend and a colleague of his, and he treated her very affectionately, almost as if she was his little sister. I think she was 18 or 19 years old in the books, and Dandelion must have been several years older at the least. On Netflix, however, Essi is either the same age or a little older than him, and she is the one who treats Dandelion like a little brother. We see a flashback of their childhood, where she saves him from a group of bullies, and is generally a bit more active and a little less delicate than she is in the books. I suppose both versions fit their respective settings, but there are a couple of things about her which I genuinely do not like. Starting with the lesser issue, some of you will disagree, I'm sure, but it's her voice. I like the way she sings, but when she doesn't, she has this manner of speech where occasionally she would elongate certain words and it just sounds annoying to me. I can't really imitate it, so I'll play a compilation for you.
Come now, humility. We begged Drowhard to give you the gig. Military advisor. Jaskier will have to do. Grew up together.
So her voice was the smaller issue, and the big one is her relationship with Geralt. It just did not work for me. Their interactions were much deeper and much more cleverly written in the books. The scene on the balcony, for example, was quite memorable. Geralt originally kissed her at that point. It was clear that Essi had fallen for him at first sight, and Geralt was also drawn to her character, her scent of verbena, but it wasn't lilac and gooseberries, and so he couldn't stop feeling guilty and uneasy, and this whole dynamic in the story where everything about Geralt was twisted through the Yennefer prism was really well done. It almost felt like Essi's main purpose as a character was to further expand Geralt's personality and his complicated relationship with Yennefer. And Dandelion was there the whole time to essentially translate and explain to Geralt his own feelings and issues regarding Essi and Yennefer and his own perception of himself. And in doing so, Dandelion was actually indirectly telling all of that to the readers as well. And gosh, I can't put it into words well enough, but the whole story is rather cleverly written, and I definitely recommend it. On one hand, there are things that seem very surface level, like big breasts with green nipples, but all of a sudden it hits you over the head with something heavy, and I love it. Okay, let's carry on. So, this beautiful foreign princess shows up, Geralt's medallion vibrates, a fisherman has been killed by the fish people, and the human people are angry. They need Geralt's help once again. He says, fuck.
Fuck.
He takes the job and goes to sleep with Dandelion. Then suddenly, a fish monster appears. Its kind can actually be seen in The Witcher 1. The games refer to it as Vodyanoi, I think, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which I believe is the Russian word for it.
What's witcher in your language?
Which malal bull?
Which malal?
Which malal bull? Bull must be. No, bull means idiot.
But it's a general Slavic watery creature with different yet similar names in different languages. They call it Vodnik on Netflix, which is the Polish version, as well as the Czech and Slovak, I believe. But anyway, Geralt shoos it away, Essi joins in, and we see these cliffs or mountains, which are in the books, and their portrayal is rather reminiscent of those at the edge of the map in Toussaint. And then we take a look at Agloval for the first time. He is the Duke in the original story, or the Prince in this one, and he's talking to his father about his relationship with the Mermaid. Zelest is also here. In the original story, he is a mere officer, but now he's Agloval's adopted brother. And he also happens to be the bully from whom Essi saved Dandelion as a child. But back to Agloval. As I mentioned, he and Sheenaz are much younger in this version of the story. In the book, they are both rather cynical and proud, and they constantly argue. They do love each other, but it is very hard for each of them to give ground in their arguments. Agloval is kind of arrogant, and Sheenaz plays really hard to get and annoys him on purpose the whole time, and their general dynamic is significantly different. Meanwhile, on Netflix there is a very youthful aspect to their relationship, like a teenage romance of sorts, and while that's not necessarily bad, it creates a kind of tonal imbalance. Let me try to explain. The film has a very high age rating. It's 16 or 18 plus, mostly because of the prominent violence and blood and swearing.
Fuck.
But along with this, the maturity and weight of the actual story have been toned down a little. Combine that with the bright and colorful animation and the regular singing of songs, of which there were several.
But it's a moment of pain for a prince to say he loves you.
And we end up with these different elements that don't match well together. And it is quite apparent between the young lovers. We see them lying on the rocks, staring at the sea, looking all starry-eyed and in love. Then the conflict between their people escalates and things get difficult. They start arguing, your dad said this, your brother did that. They start saying things they later regret. He hurts her feelings, she starts crying. He tries to apologize, but it's too late. She makes a show of leaving. You know how it goes. And in that sense, it feels almost quaint and rather innocent. And that's fine. But then the mermaid looks back at him one final time before she leaves, tears in her eyes, and with her melodious voice says, "I liked you better when you fucked me instead of talking," or something like that. And I'm like, what? Excuse me, young lady? I don't know, maybe it's the dad in me talking, but I'm not a fan of it. Such an exchange works between, say, Geralt and Kira Metz.
Oh, Geralt. Shame you didn't talk that way when we
And it might have actually worked between these two characters in the books. But the way they are here, it just doesn't fit, in my humble opinion. And speaking of things I wasn't a big fan of, I have one more brief complaint, if I may. The film recreates a certain scene from the book, except it makes one small change that kind of ruins the whole thing. So there is a point in Sapkowski's story where Geralt and Sheenaz are having a conversation while Essi is nearby. As they speak, the mermaid teases Geralt about Essi. She calls the bard his beloved. She tells Geralt how good he and Essi look together, and things like that. Geralt, however, denies it all. He says they're not actually lovers, that he and Essi barely know each other, and he does it in a casual way, without any fear of consequences, because he assumes that Essi doesn't understand any of it. And this happens after Geralt had already kissed her. But suddenly, it's revealed that she does in fact speak the language even better than Geralt does. Eventually, the mermaid leaves, and Geralt is left with the bard, awkward and embarrassed, and all he manages to say is, "I did not know you speak the language." And Essi says, "Well, naturally, you barely know me, right?" And he's just speechless, and it's a wonderful moment. Now Netflix has basically the same scene with one major difference. Essi starts talking as soon as they meet the mermaid. Eventually Sheenaz calls them a couple and Geralt says he barely knows her. Later he's once again surprised that Essi can speak the language and she responds the same way, but it just doesn't work because the whole point of the scene depended on Geralt being under the impression that Essi doesn't understand what he says. So he said things he probably shouldn't have and was caught in the act. But here, again, it just doesn't work. So I genuinely wonder why they did this. Let me know in the comments and let us move on. So, war is brewing and it seems that the evil aunt is behind it all. She mixes a potion that will give the young mermaid legs if she drinks it, likely as an attempt to remove her from the kingdom and have her father all to herself. Also, what are those? At first, I thought they were empty eggs. Melusina was said to be infertile, and I thought she was attempting to have children. But then she adds them to the thing she's brewing, and they seem to make a clinking sound when they touch.
So just play nice and go along.
So perhaps they are glass containers? Let me know what you think. Also, Melusina calls Sheenaz Poppet. This is what Dandelion originally called Essi.
You never know what will happen, Poppet.
And now that I mentioned sounds, here's a small piece of criticism for the audio editors of the film. The variation between the loudness of different parts is way too big. If you look at the waveform, certain scenes are incredibly loud, and by comparison, certain pieces of dialogue are much too quiet. I'll give you an example you can listen to, but you have to disable YouTube's stable volume setting to hear it properly. Here's a loud part. And by comparison, here's how the quiet part sounds.
But for now, looks like Jaskier will have to do.
I know how to hurt you.
Okay, back to the story. After the scene with the potion, we learn that the beautiful foreign woman in the castle is actually Melusina in disguise. She turns out to be a mermaid shapeshifter. Geralt finds her out, she goes berserk, and eventually runs away. However, what's worse, the king himself is in league with her, as they both wish to separate the young lovers. Now, I was under the impression that this woman, aka Melusina in disguise, was prepared to be the wife of the prince. But the whole point is that the king wants to continue his legacy, his bloodline. And yet, Melusina is infertile. Maybe the king doesn't know, or maybe as a human she is fertile, it's not really explained. Ultimately, everyone gets upset with the king, and he orders them taken into custody and executed. All except for his son. He also goes to war against the Merpeople, and he takes Geralt and Dandelion to be executed all the way in the middle of wherever the battle is about to take place. Naturally, the execution is unsuccessful, and the final battle begins. Sheenaz and other Merpeople join in. Melusina appears as well, along with her followers. She shapeshifts into a massive kraken, which actually looks pretty good. You can see her body embedded within the creature, and the kraken was actually mentioned in the book but never shown, so this is another thing I like. Eventually the prince and Essi arrive, his father also comes to his senses and joins the light side, but he still tries to kill Sheenaz by cutting her close to her tail. Speaking of cutting, Essi cuts off her hair and manages to use pieces of it to tie one of Geralt's potions to his sword, which he dropped, and toss them together to him so he can drink the potion inside the kraken's belly and kill it. So Melusina dies, the humans and the fish people make peace, the king agrees to wed his son to the mermaid if she drinks the potion, but the prince deceives his father. Apparently he hasn't truly forgiven the king, and instead decides to abandon the kingdom and drink the potion himself. Luckily, it's a special type of potion which transforms whoever drinks it into the species of whomever he loves. And since he loves a mermaid, he drinks it and becomes one of her kind. This is of course unlike the original fairy tale and the Witcher books, where it is the mermaid who drinks the potion to become human or to grow legs and so on. Speaking of love, Geralt sleeps with Essi Daven, which does happen in the books too, but it's a more significant scene there. Again, it's really well written, especially Dandelion's involvement. It is one of his more insightful and deeper moments, but unfortunately on Netflix he's asleep. Also, Essi's breasts are very lore-inaccurate. At one point in the books, she compares them to those of the mermaid and is mildly embarrassed by how much smaller they are. Meanwhile, they're much too big here. What's even bigger though is the change to the ending. In the books, Dandelion gives us a rather beautiful and dreadful epilogue, a glimpse into the future. Actually, let me read it to you. This happens at their camp at night after Geralt and Essi had fallen asleep. Dandelion, staring into the dying embers, sat much longer, alone, quietly strumming his lute. It began with a few bars, from which an elegant, soothing melody emerged. The lyrics suited the melody and came into being simultaneously, the words bending into music, becoming set in it like insects in translucent, golden lumps of amber. The ballad told of a certain witcher and a certain poet, about how the witcher and the poet met on the seashore among the crying of seagulls, and how they fell in love at first sight, about how beautiful and powerful their love was, and how nothing, not even death, was able to destroy that love and part them. Dandelion knew that few would believe the story, but he was not concerned. He knew ballads were not written to be believed, but to move their audience. Several years later, Dandelion could have changed the contents of the ballad and written about what had truly occurred. He did not, for the true story would not have moved anyone. Who would have wanted to hear that the Witcher and Little Eye parted and never ever saw each other again? About how 4 years later, Little Eye died of the smallpox during an epidemic raging in Vizima, and how he, Dandelion, had carried her out in his arms between corpses cremated on funeral pyres and buried her far away from the city, in the forest, alone and peaceful, and as she had asked, buried two things with her, her lute and the sky-blue pearl, the pearl from which she was never parted. No, Dandelion stuck with his first version, and he never sang it, never, to no one. Right before dawn, while it was still dark, a hungry, vicious werewolf crept up to their camp, but he saw that it was Dandelion, so he listened for a moment, and then went on his way. Now, you may be wondering what this blue pearl is. They did not include it on Netflix, but originally, Essi had a birthday during the story. I believe she turned 19. Meanwhile, Dandelion had found a blue pearl at low tide, and he decided to give it to Essi for her birthday, but he claimed it was a gift from Geralt, and so she cherished it dearly until the very end. With that said, I believe we're done. Do let me know what you thought of Sirens of the Deep. I will not make any more final statements. I believe I've said everything I wanted to, so I shall just thank you all for watching. Special thanks to my supporters and YouTube members, and until the next video, stay tuned and be good.